1996 Central High School student Robbie Weirdicht, Dwayne Johnson, is in the locker room shower dancing and lip-syncing to En Vogue's My Lovin'. A group of high school bullies led by Trevor Olson, Dylan Boyack, come in and mock Robbie since he is overweight and dorky. Meanwhile, a school assembly goes on with the whole senior class honoring its most popular student Calvin, the Golden Jet, Joyner, Kevin Hart. Trevor and his goons carry Robbie into the gym and slide him across the floor butt naked. Everyone laughs at Robbie, except for Calvin, who gives him his jacket to cover himself up. Robbie runs out of the gym, utterly humiliated. Calvin walks to the bar and is surprised to find that Robbie has completely transformed into a muscular guy. The two have drinks and catch up. As Bob leaves for a moment, a man walks by and takes Bob's chair. Calvin tells the guy to give it back, but the guy's friends stand up menacingly. Bob returns and tells them to apologize for disrespecting Calvin. One of the goons happens to have a gun. Bob takes his shot and simply says, "I don't like bullies," before kicking all their asses in less than 10 seconds. In the morning, a group of CIA agents led by Pamela Harris, Amy Ryan, show up at Calvin's door looking for Bob. Calvin says he's on the couch, and the agents head in. Bob is nowhere to be found. Harris explains to Calvin that Bob is wanted for murder and conspiracy to commit treason. The agents follow Calvin to work in case he makes contact with Bob. Sure enough, Bob calls Calvin and says he is somewhere in the building. Harris leads the agents to that specific floor, but Bob is really hiding in Calvin's office. Bob reveals he is in the CIA and that the people that want the satellite codes are willing to kill for them. Bob calls for an Uber to pick them up, which will be in 6 minutes. He times his next moves accordingly. Bob takes Calvin's tie and wraps it around the sprinkler on the ceiling. He then lights it on fire before Calvin runs outside to alert everyone to Bob's presence. The agents run up and start shooting at Bob, but the man effortlessly hits back and incapacitates most of the agents. He and Calvin are then cornered by Harris and the other agents. At the right moment, the sprinklers go off, giving Bob the chance to wheel Calvin away in a mail cart and burst out a window. They land on the company's inflatable balloons and ride away in the Uber. Calvin meets Maggie at the office of a marriage counselor named Dan, who is really Bob. They have a session in which Calvin is made to look like a bad guy who is hurting his and Maggie's relationship. After Maggie leaves, Calvin threatens Bob with calling Harris. Bob knows he wouldn't do that. The two of them go to the office of someone that can help them out on their mission. Unfortunately for Bob, this person is Trevor Olson, now played by Jason Bateman. After Trevor gets them what they need, Trevor brings up the incident that has traumatized Bob. Trevor claims to have found religion and he delivers a heartfelt apology to Bob, which he quickly takes back as he was faking. He's still a dick that thinks little of Bob. Calvin waits for Bob to kick his ass too, but Bob freezes up and decides to leave. As they leave the office, Bob and Calvin are detained at the CIA headquarters. The agents start to torture Bob to get info out of him by breaking one of his fingers. Filled with regret, Calvin fights back and rescues Bob, leaving the other agents in cuffs. Calvin apologizes to Bob for what he did, deciding he still wants to help him. Bob forgives him and proceeds to give him a high five, only to see his messed up finger. He pops it back into place. The three all find themselves over a small bridge. Calvin has a gun in his hands, and he aims it at both Bob and Phil. He shoots Bob in the leg, but he holds the gun on Phil. Phil says he faked his own death and set Bob up simply because he was just annoyed with Bob as his partner, always being a dork and going on about how Calvin was his hero. Before Phil can kill Calvin, Bob rips out Phil's throat, just like Roadhouse, and pushes him into the river. Bob apologizes to Calvin for shooting him, saying he needed to make it look convincing. The three enter the reunion. A new prom king is announced, and it's Bob. Calvin tells Maggie he hacked into the school's voting system and gave him the honor. Trevor and his buddies go up to make fun of Bob, but he won't have any of it, and he gives Trevor a punch that he's had coming for 20 years. Bob goes on stage and gives a speech stating that he's come to accept who he is and acknowledging Calvin as his friend. He then proceeds to take his clothes off, no longer ashamed of himself. The others cheer him on. Bob is then approached by Darla McGuckian, Melissa McCarthy. He takes off her glasses, claiming she is beautiful as she is. They then kiss. Bob and Calvin go on to dance. Months later, Maggie is pregnant with her and Calvin's first kid. Bob arrives to pick Calvin up to hang out. He gives Calvin back his jacket that he gave him 20 years earlier. The two then head off.